Welcome back. David Heurtel in for Elias. Well, Canada's new regulations mandate that major online streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify contribute 5% of their Canadian revenue to support local content creation. That's following a decision by the CRTC. So, when we have tech-related questions like this whole streaming industry that is in massive transformation here in Canada, who better to turn to than tech advisor, investor, and author of Control Alt Delete and Monday morning second breakfast regular, Mitch Joel is on the line. Mitch, thank you as always.
Happy Monday, David. Always great to be here.
Happy Monday.
We have a lot of our citizens eye roll and wonder how much more money are we going to try to use to support these media entities. This is, I think, should be a tough one for consumers to think about. One is we have to face the reality that we have all Canadian platforms available in Canada that aren't Netflix or Spotify. We have Crave, we have CBC Gem, which are all premium streaming services that people can access anytime, that has unlimited ability to put on whatever content they really want. I think we can all admit that whenever things like this happen at scale, who ultimately pays? The consumer is going to pay. They'll either raise the prices, which I think would be a good alternative to what I think will be the ultimate problem, which is I do not want them to pull what Facebook pulled in getting out of the news in Canada and simply leaving. Netflix and Spotify might simply say, this is becoming untenable to our business model, and unfortunately, we are no longer available in Canada. I believe that that would be more detrimental than beneficial, and I think the Canadian government would probably agree with me on this with Facebook and not having news, that it hasn't effectively helped all of these local media channels.
So this is expected to generate around $200 million annually, and the goal is that it support local news and domestic content. Are we trying to do here what we did with basically TV production? Basically saying, okay, well, you have to set a cut aside for local production. That was the TV deal, the TV production company deal the CRTC imposed. Now we're doing this for local news content. First of all, is $200 million even enough? And will it actually make a difference, do you think, in terms of generating more local news and more local content?
Look, the hope is that the funding will be directed towards these critical areas. They're talking about things like local news, French language content, Indigenous programming. They are hoping to potentially revitalize these sectors. That's the spin they're going to talk about. Ultimately, will it go down and trickle down to that area? Hard to know. It's hard to know if we're going to see an uptick in creators, or if there are creators out there who feel like the lack of access is the problem. The other interesting aspect is this isn't that day and age anymore. That's quite antiquated. We had that also in music with CanCon, Canadian Content Music. One of the challenges with CanCon was also the percentage of the production to qualify towards being recognized as Canadian. So you have artists like Bryan Adams who have been very vocal about the fact that they will use world-class producers and songwriters in other studios, and his music would not ultimately be considered Canadian in that. There's that reality to it as well. Until we really see what the definitions are, it's hard to make heads or tails of this, other than it feeling like instead of the government supporting these initiatives, let's make the big tech players pay for it because they have all this money. I often wonder if the hands we're playing here in Canada can really play, if we're boxing in the same weight class as these as these other organizations. This is really the biggest concern I have, is that, look, we are in a place where if you have, let's say, a young Indigenous group of people who want to create some local news channel, they don't necessarily need the distribution. The distribution is fundamentally free. They could do it on Instagram, on TikTok, or YouTube. And they can build it to a point where they themselves are monetizing it through their creator programs. And then should it scale to the point where it's successful, you have the big players come in. Look no further than Vice. Vice was a local Montreal newspaper that grew and grew, moved to New York, scaled, and then they got distribution deals with HBO and investment from Disney. So there are opportunities here that I don't really feel are being properly explained, as if we don't do this, all of these voices are suddenly silent. I don't really prescribe to that since we have the advent of the social web.
At the end of the day, Mitch, isn't part of all this also choices we collectively have made? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm the one that is subscribing to Netflix or Amazon Prime or Spotify. I'm the one that is no longer watching local content. I'm the one that's no longer subscribing to local news media, and my eye is theoretical here. It's just, I'm just saying, well, the Canadian consumer has voted here with their dollars and their eyeballs. Isn't it true?
The argument could be made, of course, yes, but the argument could also be made that in platforms like that, if you were exposed to more Indigenous, French, or Canadian-based content, might you choose that? Might you be introduced to it in a different way? And I do feel that that is a fair and just argument. I just don't know that this expectation of adding a tax onto these streamers is the way to do it. We have to remember that they're already paying taxes. Yeah. They're also generating a ton of revenue for a lot of these companies. Yeah. Why? Because most of us have local internet service providers, and we're paying a lot more, even though the fees in Canada are ridiculous compared to other regions in the world, to have more bandwidth because we're consuming more streaming content. So yes, I do believe that you are correct. I also do believe that the more places that can highlight these types of local voices is good for local voices, but it's not like without that, they have no voice. And I think prior to that, when you have a band or artist from Canada who's trying to get their music out and it can't get on the radio because it's always Metallica, Bon Jovi, and U2, there's a bit of a precedence or conversation to have around, shouldn't we be funding more towards local? I don't think we shouldn't not to do that, but the access points have changed and these artists can get their voice out.
You know, when you have companies like Apple that have a bigger market cap than the entire GDP of Canada, I'm like, and you mentioned this earlier. It's not like we're on an even playing field here. What would you see as the better solution, or how do we compose with this new reality? Because I totally agree with you. We're using a 1960s, 70s solution to a 2024 situation. And so what would be the path to take with these giants?
Culture. Improve the culture by having more voices rise. As those voices rise, there'll be more demand for those voices, and those platforms will proactively want to license and do deals with these content creators and these amazing parts of our world of voices that haven't been heard. If we can do it that way, I believe it solves even for things like when we talk locally about the French language and issues there. It's culture. If you make the culture interesting, people will be interested. I always joke and think about Tête à Claque, which some people will remember. Yeah. That brought the culture forward. And it got people excited who typically might not have been understanding of the difference between Quebecois French versus French you might hear if you go to Paris. All of those things, I believe, elevate the culture. Some of it is maybe a bit more low ball, some of it is more high ball, but that's what we need to do as a culture. Continue pushing the culture forward. It will have these organizations, instead of being taxed, begging and paying us for access to that content.
I'm listening to you, and what I'm thinking of is Squid Game from South Korea, right? Is that illustrating your thoughts here?
It's a great example. Yeah. Look no further than the artists we have locally. Look no further than musicians that we have here. Justin Bieber is discovered by a U.S. Agent, and that agent and manager, Scooter Braun, takes and elevates that music well beyond the boundaries of Canada, but also making him an international and local sensation. You're Celine Dion. We just had an incredible documentary about her. It was her music, her ability to bring that all together that gets an audience enraptured with that. And I do think and see, even on TikTok, local influencers creating channels that have hundreds of thousands of followers, and they're only speaking locally, but they have a global audience. These are the things we can now leverage. And I don't think by trying to penalize Netflix or Spotify for being successful in Canada with more taxes, especially if they leave, that's going to help the greater goal. As always, great insights. Appreciate your time, Mitch. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Mitch Joel, tech advisor, investor, and author of Control Alt Delete. You heard him this morning on Second Breakfast with Andrew Carter.